So we've seen some ins and outs of pollination by animals and abiotic pollination. And today's topic is focusing more on similarities across broad groups of plants. And so there's this topic called pollination syndromes. And that's the topic for today. Syndrome, that term means basically a collection of features that all kind of roll together. And so in pollination and flowers, we have lots of different species with lots of different kinds of flowers, but there's some similarity across different species. And the syndromes concept kind of explains why different plants should have similar looking flowers. So starting off, this is an example here. Lots of different plant groups with small flowers that are clustered together, right? So you can see in parentheses, these are all different plant families and the members of those different plant families. White petaled flowers, a little bit of a pollen offering toward the tip here, maybe some nectar buried in there. And the sizes, the color, white, kind of a similar shade here. Sizes of flowers, the abundance of flowers, the accessibility of the flowers, all these seem to line up pretty well. So why should that be? If you took a bunch of flowers and you just let them evolve into whatever they're going to be, maybe you'd expect a different flower for each kind of pollinator and thousands of different kinds of flowers matching up with thousands of different kinds of animals that might pollinate them. But the reality is that the animals that visit these flowers are visiting lots of different flowers. They got some choice in the matter, so they might go to one or another. They might shift as the year goes on. So you visit one of these species in the spring, and it's only got flowers open for a brief period of time. And then after that, you've got an animal that needs some food. So one of the explanations for pollination syndromes is that these animals are keying into some commonalities in places they can reliably get food, nectar food, pollen food as they go through their seasons. And the plants have kind of keyed into that, and they've become available for those same animals at different times. Another one is just the common signaling here. So if you're out in the world and you want to draw the attention of an animal, you might be needing to advertise in a way that's familiar to them. So if you got a new restaurant chain that opens up, it's going to have to advertise in a way that kind of makes you know what kind of restaurant you're going to by the advertising. Not so different from how the flowers are doing it. So this concept of pollination syndromes, sometimes there's some rather similar flowers in distant groups in ways that you might not expect. So some examples here, we've got similar shades, shapes, and even the aspect of these flowers kind of pointing downwards. Pretty similar presentation, even though these are in different groups. When I say different groups, from an evolutionary standpoint, we're talking about them evolving from different starting points. So they didn't have a common ancestor that had flowers looking like this. They both independently evolved their way to having this kind of flower. So that's a form of convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is usually an indicator that something is under natural selection. So there's a drive to succeed in a specific way, and they're both drawn to that same final conclusion because, again, in both of these situations, the end result is they are attractive to a particular kind of animal, and they are reliably visited by that animal. And if these plants are sort of competing for the same pollinator, then that probably is a good, effective pollinator that's going to be good at transferring pollen of a variety of species. So our images here also kind of highlight another feature. I might have picked a couple that have flowers that look the same, but I've also chosen images that show on the left a bird visiting those flowers, and on the right we've got a bee visiting those flowers. So one thing we'll talk about with this topic is that these pollination syndromes are not absolute. You can't always look at a flower and know who's going to visit it. Okay, so first pollination syndrome, kind of one to get out of the way, but still counting as a pollination syndrome, is wind pollination or abiotic pollination. And there's a lot of commonalities here for a different reason than we're going to talk about with the animal pollinators. So in animal pollinators, flowers end up looking similar because they're drawing the attention of similar animals, or they're rewarding them in similar ways. And this is a component of animal behavior in those biotic pollinations. In abiotic pollination, the trends are really just to increase the efficiency of transferring pollen without the use of animals. So some examples here. These are both the same kind of plant. We've got walnut in the male form here. These are catkins of male flowers, not quite open yet. But each of these is going to release a whole bunch of pollen. It's a cluster of flowers. Lots of pollen. That's a feature we often find in wind-pollinated plants. Their individual pollen grains have a lot lower success than biotic pollination. They just have to float and hopefully land where they need to be. That means you got to add a lot of them into the air. The female component, we're often looking at big stigmas. So again, capturing pollen out of the air. If you're going to catch something out of the air, you're going to need a bigger surface area, a big glove to catch it with. So we see big stigmas here in the walnut female flowers, and lots of male flowers that are reduced. Both of these are not really attractive, right? If you were an animal looking for a place to eat, neither of those is really advertising to an animal, come on and get some nectar reward. They probably aren't offering a nectar reward. That's another feature you often find in the wind-pollinated flowers. So not attractive, not smelly, not rewarding anybody, but instead shifting most of their focus to big pollen production and a little more emphasis on pollen recovery from the air. Now, with that in mind, it's good to mention that what we call abiotic pollination, there's some groups that just, you look at them and you say, of course, that's going to be pollinated by the wind. One of those groups is the grasses. So these are both a couple of examples of grass flowers. These are individual grass flowers here, and the fuzzy part is the stigma, and these colorful red bits, these are the anthers. And you can see the big emphasis on lots of pollen shown by big anthers. So big anther is going to release a lot of pollen there, big feathery stigmas. So this plant is still equipped to do some good wind pollination. But what do we have here? We've got a fly visiting. So none of these pollination syndromes are absolute. Many of them are, 50% at best. If you're trying to predict the kind of pollination mechanism that's going to happen. And in these examples, just you can imagine that maybe there's an advantage for these animals visiting these flowers. There's always the possibility that pollen is a food. There's a possibility that some sugary substances are oozing out of these stigmas or other parts of the plant that might draw animals in to visit them. And, animals are just, especially animals like this, are in the habit of visiting flowers, and maybe once in a while they'll visit flowers like this. Okay, so again, another one of these images of a habitat. Imagine yourself a pollinator. You know where to go to get some food. This image shows a whole bunch of flowers. The most visible flowers on here are the ones that are basically the same kind. These are trillium flowers. And so the animals are out in the world looking for their food, really. So they're looking for food from flowers, the kind of animals that end up being pollinators anyway. So they're looking for pollen, they're looking for nectar. And how do they find it? Well, both of those things are pretty small. So they rely on the plants to signal to them that they've got a reward in there. So these flowers have big white petals. They're visible from quite a distance away. That draws your eye, same as it would draw an insect in. And then they visit the kind of the business part of this flower, and they can get pollen and or nectar, whatever they're interested in. So again, scanning a habitat, if you're looking for this particular signal that you're used to finding rewards at the end of, then in this environment, you might be visiting all of these white flowers. In a different environment or an environment of mixed flowers, you might be visiting only one of the available flowers in a place. Okay, so looking at animals that pollinate, there are quite a few different kinds of animals that are pollinators around the world. So some of these a little more reliable, and depending on the region where you locate them. So flies, maybe don't always think about flies. This is even more of like a house fly, so not necessarily one of these more typical pollinating flies, but flies in general are able to be pollinators. Bees and wasps, we don't always think about wasps as effective pollinators. We think about bees quite often. There's lots of different kinds of bees. and different kinds of wasps, and they are often visitors of flowers. And really, for the plant, all it needs is someone who's going to visit the flowers, get pollen on their body, and continue to visit flowers of the same species. Other ones around our area, not too common to have bird pollination. Bird pollination and bat pollination, these are enriched a little more in warmer parts of the world, areas closer to the equator. We're looking at animals here with rather large bodies, and for our environment to be able to sustain birds completing, having full meals through most of the year, that's a little harder for our local plants to accomplish. You probably had the experience in the field already that our local flowers are often small and not quite so abundant as these, or not so bountiful, not so big. We do have, you might have experienced noticing hummingbirds. We do have hummingbirds that grow around our area, and that would be visiting flowers, not too different from the one that's shown here. All right, so birds, bats, and then I mentioned ants on here. I've got an image of an ant. Ants are not always great pollinators. They're good flower visitors sometimes, but they are more in their foraging strategy is more of an out and back strategy. So if they went to a flower and got a meal, they would then go back to their colony, and not necessarily between flowers of the same kind. As opposed to a bee behavior is a lot more commonly foraging one flower to the next over and over again, a little bit better for pollination. Okay, so I mentioned before what a syndrome is. Here's another set of examples of these kind of reddish flowers with long tubes hanging down again, narrow openings, and pretty similar in appearance and in these three different plant families. So again, independent evolution toward this endpoint of very similar flowers. And as we talked about before, the benefit of this, big benefit to the plant, is that they can, by conforming to a syndrome, kind of communicate to an animal that they are a good place to visit. And you'll get basically the same kinds of pollinators as your other plants. So let's say this plant was already established in an area, and this plant either moved into the area or evolved to have this kind of form of flowers. It could start picking up the same kind of animals that were already visiting this other plant. And so it's a little bit of a, I don't know, it's like dressing like other people, you know what to expect when people dress alike to kind of convey the same appearance, the same set of, I don't know, whatever you want to draw your conclusions about how people dress. Okay, so some features that kind of wrap up together to tell us about pollination syndromes. Kind of think about the different animals that could be visiting, and some of them are the kinds of animals are determined by accessibility, attraction, things like that. So this one falls into the category of accessibility, really. These are two different species in the genus Penstemon, and they've got very similar flowers. You can see there's a slight difference in the shade of these flowers. The reproductive parts are in about the same place. The rewards are probably pretty comparable. The pollen offering, again, probably similar. But they're about twice as big in this plant on the right. So Penstemon grandiflorus, that name means big flowers. And over here, gracilis is more like slender. And so if you're a bee and you, to pollinate this plant, need to access some nectar at the base of this floral tube, then this has got to be big enough to accommodate you. So if you are a big-bodied bee, you may fit into this one and not fit into one of these. So sometimes a plant excludes an animal to kind of narrow the kinds of animals that might be visiting. Also visible on this one on the left, something we talked about before, some sticky hairs all over this plant, so maybe a good deterrent against ants trying to get at its resources. Flower orientation, this is a big part of pollination syndrome because there are different animals that access flowers in different ways. So bees, for example, pretty commonly will approach flowers that are bilaterally symmetrical, that they fly in from the side, and kind of have to investigate. So bees have again, a really strong drive to probe flowers to investigate what's inside of flowers, even though it's not visible on the outside. And so on this one, they can kind of crawl in, grab hold, and explore the pollen tube at the flower tube, the corolla tube in the back here, the petal tube, and get their nectar reward and position them pretty well to touch the reproductive parts. So a bilaterally symmetrical flower has a little bit of an advantage where the flower can kind of control which way the animal accesses it. So from the side means you can put your pollen on the top or on the bottom of an animal a little more reliably. Whereas in contrast, a lot of flowers have this kind of dinner plate open access format where these radially symmetrical flowers, you could access it from any direction and basically have the same experience. Now it does have pollen available in all directions, and it's got a variety of carpels available at the center. So anyway you're approaching this flower, you're going to get a similar experience, but a little more maybe haphazard as far as where the pollen ends up, or maybe consistently on the bottom of an insect that's crawling around on here. Just a difference, right? So available to put pollen on a variety of pollinators coming from a variety of directions, as opposed to on the left coming from one direction per flower. Mentioned before getting into these flowers. So some flowers are open versus closed. I chose a couple here that are in the same plant family, the bean family, Fabaceae. And the one on the left, this senna flower, you can see the reproductive part. So we've got their anthers here, making pollen available. And let's see, I think this, sorry, I'm drawing a little blank. Maybe somewhere in there is a style and stigma for the female part of this flower. And then another feature that we see in a lot of our local bean family plants is to kind of conceal the reproductive part. So inside of this structure called the keel here, inside of here is pollen and the style and stigma of the female component, but you can't see them from the outside. So if part of your visual cue to identify a flower you want to visit is being able to see the pollen you're going to get, this one would be a pretty good way to conceal and keep that evidence from somebody else. So if you're like a beetle, for example, just looking for pollen and you don't see pollen on here, that might cause you not to be attracted to it. Different animals approach flowers in different ways, and one of the ways that they approach is actually landing and accessing the nectar on the flower. So we've seen a few of these before. Excuse me. We've seen a few of these before. This is a bee accessing a sage flower. It's grabbing on and probing its tongue into the base of the flower, and in the process getting some pollen on its back. So this bee's got a hold on. Bees are not very good hover eaters. They've got to land and get the food that they're going to get. Whereas some animals, like our hummingbird here, that's their jam. They don't really land on a flower to get their food. And you can almost see it in the way the flowers are arranged in these different groups. So sometimes you can just visualize the mechanics of it. So these flowers are hanging down. If you wanted to land on here as a bee, you'd be able to maybe grab the opening, but it's a really long tube and the food's way at the back here, and it's a narrow passage you couldn't crawl into. So this is very good at excluding a bee from getting at the nectar reward in this plant. But instead, it's actually a really good approach to be a hummingbird on this one, where you've got a long beak plus a long tongue that can access the base of this. Coming in from the bottom while flying is a pretty capable thing for a hummingbird to do. And maybe contrast over here, the bee is provided with a landing platform and sizes that are more appropriate to its body to get the nectar rewards. So also on those lines, the color of the petal can be a good signal for inviting or really uninviting certain kinds of insects. So for example, red is a color that is not particularly visible to bees. And so you often see red as a color that signals to birds that there's food. Birds can see red just fine. Bees not so great at seeing red. And so it's like an advertisement over here to birds that would not be attractive to the bees, same as this one on the left. Just some evidence for that. Up on the top, these are the wavelengths of light that humans can see. With the wavelengths here, their peak absorbance, 424, 530, etc., and the colors that go along with that. So bees, not quite as much into the red spectrum. Birds have a little bit of an edge perceiving red. Bees do have an edge over here. This is shown black because it's not visible to us, but this is actually out in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum. So ranges of light, even though we can't see them, you can see humans, our color perception kind of drops off here in what becomes ultraviolet. So it wouldn't be visible to us, but bees can see it. And to some extent, birds are able to see in that zone. Just really generalizing here, of course, but humans, we know a lot about what colors they can perceive, and then you can kind of generalize to bees and birds. So again, with the feature of red flowers are good, kind of a deterrent to bees. They're not as attractive. But something that is attractive to bees are often differences in color. So color contrast can be a nice attraction for bees. And sometimes they get called nectar guides. So if you see flowers that have different colors, stripes are often a pattern you see, or a different color at the center of the flower versus toward the outside, as in this iris example. These are sort of more subtle signals to often interpreted by bees for telling them exactly where they need to go. So here we've got an iris, it's kind of pinched up here, and the yellow zone kind of tells you, well, there's something more interesting there. Get attracted by the blue and then visit the yellow, and that's going to lead to where the reward is. Foxglove here, kind of an interesting dappled pattern, but highlighting the inside of this flower as opposed to the outside. And I mentioned the ultraviolet light perception of bees. It's a little hard for us as humans that can't see ultraviolet light. It's hard for us to we certainly can't see it, and it's even hard to kind of visualize artificially where the colors are on these different flowers. And this is a pattern that often shows up, that we have flowers that to our eyes just look one color. So they're kind of golden here, nothing too special. Over on the right-hand side, you can do this with camera filters. And this shows you that in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum, there's actually a difference in the reflection of the ultraviolet light on the outside of these petals versus the inside. So we're getting more of that nectar guide appearance, where the inside is a different color than the outside, but it's not in a color range that we can see with our eyes. So in the center here, I just call this bee vision. This is a collection of the two, this kind of plain human visible spectrum combined with the ultraviolet spectrum. It's kind of what it would look like to a bee if they went to visit these flowers. So kind of an interesting feature that just hides under the surface that people weren't noticing for a long time. Sometimes makes for really nice images. So this is another one of those kind of artificially combined images that makes use of some UV photography. And one of the things we'll do in this semester is kind of show you evidence and experiments. Lots of these things are ripe for experiments, and I really enjoy the kind of work that this lab does. And this was a simple, rather simple experiment where they took flowers that have differences in the ultraviolet light absorbance, and they wanted to detect like how important was this ultraviolet light reflectance. And what they did was they put sunscreen on here. So sunscreen is when you put it on your skin, it's not visible to our eyes. But maybe you've seen an image or video of somebody putting on sunscreen under ultraviolet light camera, and it actually just shades them out to like black in the ultraviolet light spectrum. And so this would take a normal flower and turn it into one of these absorbing flowers. And what they show you is the attraction rate here. So the attraction rate goes down in these flowers that are not reflecting or equally reflecting. So without the contrast, the attraction goes way down. Nice evidence for the need to have this ultraviolet light contrast. Also on the level of attraction, we saw scent. It was important for flowers, and you can have a lot of very specific scents. I would say this kind of information is something that wasn't able to be investigated for a while. It's a little more labor intensive than just getting out a camera. What they can do for these is they can basically draw a vacuum and pull the air off of a flower, and then run some chemical analyses to find out what molecules are present inside of that air. And this study was investigating a specific molecule called diacetyl, shown there, and it's this peak here. So if the scent profile of a species has diacetyl, pretty strong peak here and pretty strong peak here, that's a component of the smell. We don't always think about all the individual molecules that we smell, but in an insect, their antennae are sensitive to scent chemicals, and they can respond and sort of have there's a cool part of this where they basically see the chemical response light up as electricity in the presence of particular molecules. So this study did this electrophysiological measurement, and they found out that diacetyl is something that they're responding very strongly to. They got receptors for it. They can detect it in the environment. And it turns out, as it says here, these are what they call oil collecting bees. So there's this bees that actually collect oil as part of their mating process to like perfume themselves up. And so they're going out into the world looking for the oil that they're going to need. Haven't really talked about that much. This is one of the third reasons you might visit a flower. It's not food, but nonetheless a pretty valid reason to visit a flower if you're going to get something valuable out of it. So a variety of flowers here, a couple of them in the same genus, Lysimachia, and then a couple others have figured out this scent chemical as a good attraction for male bees here. Another one here, nectar reward. So the reward in flowers is often tailored to the animals that visit. And this is just under the control of natural selection. And basically, the reward was going to have to be sufficient to keep an animal coming back, right? So if you visit a flower and you get a poor, like a low volume, watery reward by visiting the flower, you're going to say, maybe I'm not going to keep going to that flower. That was a lot of work to fly over there, and I didn't get a lot out of it. So the flowers need to incentivize the animals enough that they keep coming back. And it turns out that different animals need different sort of qualities of incentive. And one of them here is nectar volume. So birds, for example, much larger animals than insects, and they need a larger volume of nectar. So if you're a plant and you have landed on birds as your pollinators, they might do some great things for you in the pollination department, but they require payoff in more nectar. So that's kind of a component of the strategy, is being able to pay your pollinators. Another one is the sugar concentration. So one of the features we see in birds is high volume, but low concentration. So these plants are giving away a little bit more water proportionally. But again, it's whatever is necessary to get those animals to come and visit. Some flowers are just incentivizing their animals with a pollen reward, as shown in a few of these examples. Kind of an extreme example. This bee is thoroughly covered in pollen. Some cases, they are pulling it out of anthers where it's a little hard to get. They've got to vibrate their body to get the pollen out of those anthers. And we see that in a few different groups. This one's close up, and you can see the evidence that somebody has basically gripped onto this, made a little damage on the anthers of this flower. So it's evidence that somebody's already been there to pollinate it. Beetles. All right, so we kind of talked about the different strategies, different varieties of different variations of what plants can put into their flowers to attract different kinds of pollinators. And we'll spend a little time now talking about the different kinds of pollinators in these really broad categories. The whole concept of pollination syndromes is something that's kind of ebbs and flows depending on interest. Sometimes people like to investigate when they say, maybe there's not such a strong syndrome here. maybe it's more of a incidental coincidence. And then other times it swings back and they say, well, these are definitely flower collections that are arriving at the same conclusion, and they're way more similar than we'd expect them to be by chance. It's fun to talk about at any rate, and you can always test this out for yourself. If you're out in the field and you think you've got a set of flowers that look like they're beetle pollinated, you can hang out and see if you get some beetle visitors. So beetle pollination, features of beetle pollination, basically you kind of think about beetles as not being very precise flyers. So these beetles do have wings, but their wings are concealed under these heavy armored other wings. So their outer wings are the shell basically is the outer wing of the ladybug here. Inside of them are flying wings that they can use to get around from flower to flower, but they're not the best at flying. So they've lost one pair of wings already, and a little more devoted to crawling than flying in the average activity. So if you're not a precision flyer, it's important to have a big surface to land on, not any necessity to like hover for, definitely not hovering anywhere, or even flying specifically into like a tunnel or anything like that. So beetle flowers, often just lots of them clustered together, open buffet of lots of different flowers. Beetles are often in for eating pollen, so lots of pollen available on the surface. You see these anthers kind of up at body height all over this collection of flowers. Same thing over here, same thing over here. So just sort of brushing pollen on the bodies of the beetles as they walk through. Lots of similarities, I think you'll agree. And then the white color is also one we often find in beetle pollination. Butterflies, frequently visiting a little more colorful flowers, flowers in kind of the pastel shades. And butterflies also not precision flyers. So when butterflies fly, they kind of flop, flop, flop through the air. When it comes time to land to feed, they have to land so that they can eat. So they need a landing surface. And they do have going for them this long proboscis. So this is their feeding apparatus, which means that they can probe that into flowers that might have a narrow opening and a long tube. That's what's going on here. Long tube in the flower, nectar at the bottom. Same thing here, a little harder to see, but each of these is a tube of flower, basically. Tubes in this one. So landing surface, relatively small flowers, and flowers with kind of a tubular shape to them. Bees, probably the most common pollinators. If you were to ask somebody who is a pollinator, they would probably come around to bees. Here we see honeybees. Honeybees in North America are not native to North America, but we do have lots of bees. It's one of those things that you kind of have to start noticing, and then you should notice that there are lots of different kinds of bees out there. So we have plenty of native bees. They're very diverse in size and colors, and they're also frequent flower visitors. So when we talk about bees, we're not just talking about honeybees, but different kinds of bees, from the giant bumblebees down to some smaller ones like sweat bees, all kind of flower visitors. So those generalizations we made about the flower color that they can perceive, those are kind of generic to bees. So visible in the UV range of the spectrum, not so much in the red end of the spectrum. And so often in bees, you get purples and yellows in the colors of flowers that they're going to visit. A pretty wide variety. So on the right-hand side, we've got a flower that this bee's got to grab onto and approach from the side. This one is one that they can access from the top. Again, bee behavior is basically to forage their environment, looking for food that's offered by flowers. So they might have their preferred choices, but at different times of the year, they'll take what's available. Now, I mentioned also that there are flies involved. There are lots of different kinds of bees and lots of different kinds of flies that are routine flower visitors. And I have on here a mix of the two. So 3 of these have bee in their name: the halictid bee, the carpenter bee, the bumblebee. Those are bees proper. And then over here, we've got a couple that are flies: the bee fly. Talk about confusing names. Just a cute little thing, isn't it? So bee fly here is big fuzzy body, and then a syrphid fly. To me, the eyes on the flies are just much bigger eyes, kind of a broader part of the face where the eyes are attached to. A little hard to see on the bees here, but a feature of the bees and wasps is that they have a constricted portion between the thorax and the abdomen. Uh, Not always so obvious, especially in this bumblebee. I couldn't really tell you it's there, but that's one of their features. And then the ability to sting in at least a few of these in the bees, and then the flies would not have that, even though they're using a little bit of mimicry to look like they could sting you. This fly is not capable of stinging you. I guess one more feature is the flies have technically only two wings, so one pair of wings. The other pair is modified into something that's not wings. And then our bees have two pairs of wings. A little hard to point out on any of these, but if you know what you're looking for, they're there. Bees have gotten a lot of attention as important components of the environment. A lot of people are concerned about the decrease in numbers of bees. And then there's also kind of on the human side, there are these bees that do services for people. And so we see honeybees. There's no accident that there's a lot of honeybees around. The people who keep honeybees for the purpose of making honey, but also for the purpose of pollinating crops. So some crop plants can pollinate themselves. They don't need bees, or maybe they don't need any specific kind of animal. A lot of them can actually self-pollinate and self-fertilize, and they don't need to worry about being visited by an animal. But other ones, this one here is probably highlighting the almond. So down here, almond flowers, which produce almonds in the end, very dependent on bees. So they have people come and they bring their domesticated bumblebees into the orchards. They do pollination. And that service is, as this article says, very valuable to the process. So if you don't have bees, you don't get the almonds, and a lot of money is lost. $200 billion per year. So this is, I think, a combination of animals that are kept by people and just these natural animals that are out in the environment that would do the pollination. All right, over to birds. See lots of examples here of bird-pollinated flowers that are hanging down. Locally, we've got hummingbirds. They're more of a North and South American component. In other parts of the world, they don't have so much in the way of hummingbirds. So they have other birds like sunbirds, and I'm sorry, I don't know all the names of these. But you can see a variety of birds visiting these flowers. Apart from the hummingbirds, birds often need a perch to access their flowers. So even if you're going upwards the stem of this plant here, there's still a perch to hold on to while you access some flowers. I don't know if there's a pretty common feature of tubular flowers again here. Not illustrated so much here, but often you see flowers in the red side of the spectrum. And this will depend on different parts of the world. Locally, I think ours are hummingbirds, and I don't know of other birds that pollinate locally. So here's our hummingbird again. As their name tells you, they hover. So that's the hum is a constantly moving wings. They hover. They barely ever set their feet down while they're feeding, and so they can access these flowers. And the easier access is something they can hover next to, go in from the side, or go up to a hanging down flower, and use their long beak to access tubular flowers. And this one really nicely, this image is showing the pollen, the anthers right here, and the stigma both in a same place on the feathery head of this bird. Good place to transfer and pick up pollen from. Other plants, there's a collection of plants that actually flower in the evening. And they've got white flowers for a little bit of a different reason. So white flowers during the day are a pretty good contrast against green. White flowers at night are kind of a necessity. So things are generally dark. White can increase your visibility. And a couple examples here, the cactus here, this is probably attractive to a bat. And with bats, we're looking at another large animal that needs to be fed. So big open offering here, probably a lot of nectar in the base, and then just a whole bunch of pollen being offered at the face of the animal that's going to poke into this to try and get the food. This is where the pollen is being offered, and this is where the pollen is being received from. A good place to collect it off of the animal before it gets deep into your flower. So sort of collect pollen first and then offer pollen on the way out. And this is kind of a sideways facing flower that might be hanging from kind of a vine or maybe just an upright cactus like this one. Here's some banana flowers also being visited by a bat. So a lot of bats are, they're sort of a mammal version of the birds. So they've got their certain species that are going to be interested in nectar and or pollen as a food. Our friend up here, the yucca moth, this is more of a symbiotic relationship where the yucca flowers are visited by a specific moth species that actually lays some eggs inside of the ovary as part of its reproduction cycle. So it transfers pollen, but also kind of takes up a little bit of space in the developing fruits of these plants. Similar to hummingbirds in the insect world, we've got this kind of animal called hawk moths. They are good at hovering. They also have a long proboscis, so and they're often also active at night or in the evenings. Hawk moths, so long proboscis. You can see it's kind of probing at these tubular flowers here, tubular flower here, coming in from the side over here. All right, so a few of these are, there's a lot of flowers that are pollinated. They attract animals through a form of deception. And the form of deception here is to have a flower that makes the appearance and gives off the smell of something like dead meat. So they take on this kind of maroon color, dappled with red often. It looks like a carcass out in the woods. And it has a stinky smell to go with it. So this is one we have locally. The wild ginger is a native plant to Wisconsin. This plant, Rafflesia, this is the largest flower in the world, and it's found in Southeast Asia. But similar strategies, and they get pollinated by animals that otherwise would be visiting corpses, dead animals. So they get drawn in by the scent and the appearance. They end up getting pollen on them, and then they fly on to the next one. Kind of along with that, some of these plants that are making the appearance of dead animals, they also heat their flowers. I don't know if that's true for any on the image here. They don't have the look of anything dead, but some flowers do heat up a bit during their pollination period. And the advantage, well, if it's a cool environment and an animal needs a warm place to hide, that could be an advantage. Warmth is also a good way to cause scent to get around a little bit better. So to diffuse out the scent might be an advantage of having a warmer flower, which is kind of interesting, right? Thermal image here of the inside of this flower is a lot warmer than the environment outside. So we're over 45 degrees Celsius. That's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, the environment is more around like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's another one. This is one of our local plants, the skunk cabbage. And a little more evidence, I suppose. The other ones, these are a little more on the tropical side. We can get lotus around here, but not quite so abundant. And then this one is more of a local plant. And its heat makes it a desirable place to be in the very early spring when it starts its flowering. So it heats itself up so much so that you can find these actually melting their way through snow. And they make themselves a warm place for insects. Let's say there's some insects coming out of winter dormancy and they need some food and a warm place to hide. This is a plant that can help them out. It's even got kind of a protective home shelter for them there. So it's warm on the inside and sheltered. Pretty good way to get yourself visited by insects at a time of year when insects are mostly not yet active because it's cold outside. Okay, so I mentioned that syndromes are sometimes they get more support than others, and this was one way that a study took to kind of quantify the syndrome. So they took a variety of measurements and put them in three-dimensional space, and the colors go with the kind of animals that they, according to the syndromes, would predict to visit these different flowers. And you can see here there's actually a lot of clustering where flowers that have the same kind of pollination syndrome by features that we usually expect for these different syndromes, they are very similar. They're sort of discrete groups where the fly pollinated flowers keep to their own, and they're considerably different from the moth and hawk moth pollinated flowers. So this kind of suggests that to be an effective flower, you sort of have to pick your camp and stay in it. So they're different from other pollination syndromes. Here's an interesting one, just a variety of interesting pollination strategies out there. And this is one where they discovered that a orchid, so not a flower, I don't know if you'd expect that to start mimicking a person. Orchids are pretty notorious for having some of the most extravagant pollination syndromes strategies. So orchids can make a variety of shapes and a variety of different scent chemicals. And this one, they figured out how to basically mimic body odor. And their target is to be pollinated by mosquitoes. So it's like a 1-2 interesting plant. Orchids a lot of times rather elegant plants. This one smells like an armpit. So speaking of pollination syndromes and understanding who pollinates what species, that ends up being an important consideration. If you have any species that are in danger of extinction, one of the ways that species can be endangered is if they're not able to complete their pollination. So if you've got species of a plant and they're alive, but they're not making any seeds, then that population is kind of stagnant. And so we see a few examples where, in some cases, like this plant on the left, this is a plant that no longer has its natural pollinator in its environment. So people have taken it upon themselves to do artificial pollinations. They've taken this plant into greenhouses to cultivate it. But it's a plant that's kind of at a dead end until we can get someone else to, to pollinate it naturally.